Trust for Nature plays a very particular role in conservation. Trust for Nature's space, if you like, is private land conservation.
Conservation covenants is one of the mechanisms that we use to protect private land and the flora and fauna values on private land. So what we do is we work with a landholder to use a conservation covenant to protect their property into the future.
We always thought the concept was great. It made sense, and I suppose because of the zoning in place in the Bend of Islands, we sort of thought at the time that we didn't really need it, but the planning scheme is vulnerable because it's at the whim and fancy of the government of the day, and it could change.
We have a stewardship program where we go out to sites and we visit every few years, and we develop a management plan, and we help the landholder to gain grants that might be available for the property. And we also draw up a flora and fauna list and just give them the support they need to help manage the bushland into the future.
The other thing is that it reflects your requirements. So we could have allowed stock to be on the property.
Well, I suppose one thing about having the covenant, it opened our eyes to the health of the land in general, and so we're trying to also farm in a much more sustainable way, and we've been doing an enormous amount of regeneration.
Victoria, it's the most highly cleared state in Australia, so the key threat has been the loss of native vegetation. About 80% of private land in Victoria has lost its former native vegetation, and that obviously has had sort of flow-on effects for all of the native plants and animals, and for habitats, and for the functioning of landscapes.
We haven't had lyrebirds since the 1962 fires that went through the area, and probably about 5 years ago we had sightings of a lyrebird in the area.
The message of it is the fact that wildlife corridors are so important, because the Watsons Creek goes all the way to King Lake, and so that corridor, obviously, to us anyway, is the way the lyrebirds over 40 years found their way from King Lake back to the Bend of Islands, which is pretty impressive, and it shows, as I said, the importance of these corridors and the protection of them.
Private land is not just vital to conservation, private land is fundamental to conservation. We aren't going to achieve meaningful conservation for all of our flora and fauna without thinking about how we conserve private land.
We've developed a range of other tools around the Conservation Covenant. We work in native vegetation offset, so we set up agreements between people to protect and improve vegetation to meet a regulatory requirement. We have a revolving fund which seeks to purchase ecologically important land and then transfer it to a conservation-minded purchaser. We have a property program as well, so we manage our own properties.
The work we do at the Trust is in partnerships with other organisations and other agencies. We provide a very niche service. We are experts in private land conservation. We have regional offices right throughout Victoria.
It's well organised to be able to get your money out on the ground quite efficiently. So I think that coupled with the experience and passion that people have for the organisation is really great.
It's a really revolutionary idea in many ways to think that a bank would own its own conservation properties, and that they would use those properties to not only offset carbon emissions, but also biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity. I think that partnership's really been a success to be able to talk about how a corporate can work with a not-for-profit.
We rely on our volunteers to help us manage the properties. The generosity is just astonishing.
Getting out to the properties, that's fantastic. If you ever have an opportunity to get out to the properties, you see the most wonderful properties throughout Victoria, and you get to meet the people, and they're amazing.
I think it's sort of the Aboriginal concept of occupying the land is that you're really stewards, custodians. Even though we've got the bit of paper that says we own it, it's still only one chapter in a long story, isn't it, really? And it's a pity if we do have such a narrow perspective that it's just us. It's nice to think that the values that are here are something that will be there in perpetuity.
People are just as important as the land to making all of this happen. And we hope that Trust for Nature will encourage new people to become involved in the work that we're doing, so that the legacy of those who established this 40 years ago is carried on into the future.